Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. And how is your dystopia going? Ooh, is that a new catchphrase for the show? I hope not. I just got back from New York where Naomi taped her Netflix special, which she fucking knocked out of the park. And I didn't realize how isolated we were here in Los Angeles, because in New York, you're forced to be around people everywhere on the subway. And I gotta say, my batting average wasn't great, but I did give the stink eye to everyone who was not wearing a mask, despite Naomi saying that I was going to get stabbed. And 5 of those people that I gave stink eye to, again, a small percentage, 5 of those people put their masks on. So I guess I was doing my civic duty or just being a jerk. You make the call, gentle listener. By the way, today's episode, this is fantastic. This is someone who changed the way that I see music. Yes, folks, today's guest is Terry Riley. If you don't know who Terry is, let me read you his bio right now. Originally from Colfax, California, modern composer and performer Terry Riley began studying composition and performing solo piano in the 1950s. He befriended and collaborated with composer Lamont Young, and through the 60s further refined his sound. Terry's 1964 revolutionary composition, In C, essentially launched what is now known as the Minimalist movement. The piece's interlocking, repetitive patterns changed the course of 20th century music, and its influence has been heard in the works of prominent composers such as Steve Reich and Philip Glass, as well as in the music of rock groups such as The Who and Soft Machines, as well as in his own collaborations with everyone from John Cale to Pauline Oliveros to Kronos Quartet. Since the 60s, Terry hasn't slowed down a moment and continues to compose and perform, and his latest recording is 2019's The Lion's Throne, a collaboration with singer Amelia Cooney. Yeah, wow. Terry is such a kind person to answer the email of an absolute stranger and agree to do a podcast. And be really open. I didn't just ask about, what was it like to write A Rainbow in Curved Air or whatever. We talked about his parents and his travels all over the world and how the atom bomb eventually led to a cultural opening that gave him the space to innovate. It'll all make sense when you hear it. This is great. Terry's a wonderful person. Just a slight note about the sound. At the beginning, I was using the Zoom audio, but Terry was Zooming with me from a rural part of Japan, and it started kind of cracking up, and so we switched to a voice memo on his phone, which is great, but only slightly awkward because I didn't want to show up on his voice recording too much. So, there are genuine points where we're both laughing, but I'm laughing silently on my side. But I just wanted to let you know that I think that it sounds pretty good, except for maybe, the first minute or two. And by the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you for checking out the show. I've been doing this for almost 12 years now, episode 500 coming up in a little over a month. And what I like to do here in the beginning is a little recommended if you like. If you like Terry Riley, if you like modern composition, maybe you will like these other interviews that I did with people who are in the same kind of spheres as Terry Riley, such as Arto Lindsay, David Harrington of Kronos Quartet, who has collaborated with Terry many times, Bobby Previtt, who I mentioned in this episode, Sam Prekop, indie rocker, but I would say somewhere in the same vicinity of the musical spectrum as Terry. Now, for some reason, all the episodes are up on Spotify. The last 100 are up on all the other apps. But if you like what you hear and you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that on anywhere where you get your podcast from. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. And like I said, we got some amazing episodes coming up, including the 500th episode, which I'm gonna going to keep that guest a surprise, but coming up soon is Bill Oakley, who is one of the early writers on The Simpsons, who's written some of the most well-loved Simpsons episodes from the early years. Night Jewel, I just talked to Ramona Gonzalez, who is Night Jewel, the other day, and that was really wonderful. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Terry. I was doing some research on you last night, and it's interesting. You're from Colfax, California.
Born there, yeah.
Yeah. Wait, were you raised there?
No, I was born there, and 4 years of my life I lived there, and then I came back to the area during World War II for a few years because my dad was in the military in the Pacific Campaign, and during those 2 periods I lived in Colfax, or around Colfax, but. I don't have really that much. My mother's family is from there. That's the connection. My grandmother and grandfather, I lived with them during the war.
Mm-hmm. So is there a city that you think kind of formed you as a person? Like if it wasn't Colfax, was it somewhere else? Or do you think it was Colfax, the 2 periods that you lived there?
It definitely wasn't Colfax. It's hard to say because I moved around so much. I as a kid, because my dad was in the military, we moved around a bit, and especially when he came back from the war, World War II. So I lived in South Carolina for a while, but the town that I feel kind of closest to in the States is San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where kind of my musical formative years were spent.
Do you think even like not just your formative musical years, but do you think like just your formative existential years, let's call them?
Yeah, I mean, culturally and everything, San Francisco is not a typical American city by any stretch, if there is a typical American city, but it's, I always felt San Francisco had a very Asian feel, and it's also connected to Europe in a strange way. So, but especially Asia, and I'm very attracted to Asia and Asian culture. So I think living in San Francisco, that was one of even though I didn't know it at the time, that was one of the things that made me like the place. And I was learning a lot from being there. And I like the culture that developed around there when I was young, like the beat culture that developed in North Beach. And I spent a lot of time at the beach. So.
That's right. You were there in what, the 1950s? Like at the actual center?
I came in 55, so that was kind of a nice period. The City Lights was just getting started during that period, which is sort of the hub of the beat movement. And it was a beautiful town in those days. San Francisco was a very magical place. Definitely has changed. Still has a powerful attraction for me, but it's not the town it was when I was young.
Okay, so you were formed mostly as a person then in San Francisco. How did you get there? Because I talked do you know Bobby Previtt? He's like a jazz drummer and a composer in New York.
I don't know him, no.
He comes from Niagara Falls, and he comes from a pretty like working class background. I just talked to him on the show a couple weeks ago, and he just happened to he was really into drumming, and he just happened to go to University of Rochester or Buffalo at the time when they got this grant to bring in composers like John Cage taught there, and Xenakis taught there, and it changed the trajectory of his life. And it just so happened because, and we were talking, and he was like, if you come from a working class background now, it's very difficult to become a composer or to, work in modern composition or anything like that. There's not a lot of pathways. And I'm kind of curious about, the path from Colfax to become a composer, because it doesn't seem, especially like, maybe it's just through today's lens, but it doesn't seem like it's a linear path.
nothing really happened to me there of any importance. Except living with my grandparents, who I loved, but I think where it got started for me was in Redding, California, which is a town way up north. And I went to grammar school and high school in Redding after I left Colfax. And I had a couple of good music teachers up there that kind of, although Redding is a cultural desert, nothing ever happens there culturally. Probably now it's a big city, and when I went there it was 10,000 people when I lived there. Now, so in those days it was kind of a rough-edged logging town. And now, then I met a couple of important people that influenced me a lot musically and got me really to thinking I would be a musician, that it was possible for me to be a musician, because I didn't come from a musical family either. So these people kind of took me under their wing and pointed me to where I could go next, and that was San Francisco.
Was there any kind of creative activities that you were involved in before music?
No, music's always been the thing with me. I always loved music from the time I was first memories. I remember really loving music, listening to music, and got me quite a while. I was kind of older to get started, and I think I was 8 years old before I started piano lessons. So that's old for a person that wants to. These days, they get started at 2 years old.
Yeah. Like, what was your life like? So you're moving around. You're back in. You're born in Colfax. You move around. You're back there for the war. Then you move again. Are you able to? Do you make friends? Are there? What is your life like in this period before you eventually go off to San Francisco?
Well, in order to get along with my friends in high school, I played sports. And de-emphasized the music part. My music thing was kind of on the side. Although I used to play for assemblies, and I'd play kind of like Bumble Boogie and stuff the kids could relate to. But I actually liked sports. I was playing football and baseball in Redding. But then I met one of my high school teachers, Ralph Wadsworth, who was not much older than me. Just out of college, he started teaching high school. And he sort of became a buddy of mine, even though he was my teacher. And we'd hang out a lot. And he was starting to play me recordings of music that he liked, like, Bartok, Stravinsky. Not really modern, but modern for Redding. And opened my eyes to like what was happening in contemporary music, at least contemporary music of the early part of the 20th century. And then I met another young musician, Dwayne Hampton, who was a pianist that just came back from the Curtis Institute, and he let me study piano with him. And those two people kind of really fired up my musical interest and prepared me, for moving out of Redding. So I spent a lot of time with them. They were really generous, and they felt I had potential, and they wanted to develop it. And they saw that in Redding, it's very hard to develop anything in the arts in those days. So I was lucky to have those two mentors.
Did your parents, were they, I guess maybe accepting is not the word I want, but were they approving? Did they approve of playing music? What was the parent-child relationship like for you, or in general, I guess maybe in the 40s?
Yeah, well, oddly enough, my dad was a military man. When he wasn't in the military, he was a working class person, and the strange thing is they encouraged me to do music, and even though they had nothing in there, both of them only went to the 8th grade education, 8th grade grammar school education. They weren't educated, but they got me a piano in Redding, and I had to get up in order to practice before I went to high school. I had to get up and practice, and my piano was right up against their bedroom wall, and I got up a couple hours before them and practiced there. So when I think back on that, that must have been hard for them to do, and yet they encouraged me to keep my music going. So I'd say they were encouraging without really knowing who I was or what I was trying to do.
Was that, I mean, in general, did you have, look, I have this is mostly based on my relationship with my parents and then thinking about their relationship with their parents. But like my grandfather fought in World War II, and I know that his relationship with my dad was not, it was not cold, but it wasn't exactly like, it wasn't emotionally open. You know, did you have, and in my mind, which is just projection, right? But in my mind, I'm like, oh, that's all parental relationships in the 1940s and the 1950s. Did you have like a kind of a more open relationship with them?
I would say not. I think mainly my mother was, a really simple, devoted housewife kind of person. Lived for my father, having dinner ready for him and all that. My dad had an alcohol problem, and he had a hard time opening his heart to people. He was guarded, although he was really kind of a funny guy, and as far as communicating, we only had a few moments when that I can remember when that happened. And when it happened, it was great. I could see what a great person he was. But it didn't happen very often. I mean, mainly because his own personality, probably partly because of the war. I didn't get to know him until after the war. And I think the war was such a hard thing on people and those, guys who were fighting. And he was in the Pacific for 3 years on hitting island after island. And luckily he didn't get killed, but it kind of ruined him as a person, all this violence that he had to go through. So I would never blame him for any lack of communication. I think he did the best job he could, but it was a hard time.
Yeah. Yeah, no. It's the same thing from what I understand with my grandfather, which is that like it was such a he was in Europe. He was fighting in like on D-Day, and that he just never I think he kind of just shut down, from what my dad says, after the war, and just like didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to, just the kind of like awful horrors he had seen fighting in the European theater. It was just like kind of like put a brick wall up.
Yeah, it was PTS or what we have today. Everybody had it, I'm sure. You'd have to be inhuman to go through a war and not be so affected by it. So. But they didn't talk about it much in those days. There was, everybody had it, but they drowned it in alcohol or whatever, to try to get away from those thoughts, I think. I know my dad did.
Yeah, it was called, I mean, they didn't even, they just called it being shell-shocked, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Or in my dad's case, like at the end of the war, he finally broke down, and they called it combat fatigue, and he spent a couple of months in the hospital before he came home from the Pacific. But it was kind of like a nervous breakdown. It was so intense. They weren't able to, release him into society again until he kind of got through that. But of course, those scars stay with you forever.
I'm just trying to think about like the way I grew up, and I am basically my parents, but I pushed against my parents to go do something creative, and I think it created this kind of gap that I don't know if we can get across. It's not like we have a bad relationship, but just there's like, to do creative work, I think puts you in a different mode of being. And I'm curious if it could also just be idiosyncratic. That could just be me. I'm curious if you found that with your own parents, that doing creative work, I would say probably, world changing, in your case, creative work, if that put distance between you and them.
There's a period, especially at the beginning, when they heard what I was doing and didn't understand it, that they really had hoped that I'd gone into another field or something. But as people started writing about me, and I had some press to show them, and I got signed by Columbia Records. My dad died very young, so he wasn't able to share in my life after I started becoming well known, and they could see that I was being successful. But my mother did, and once my mother saw that, and I took, when I had
a premiere. I wrote this piece for the St. Louis Symphony, which was commissioned by Carnegie Hall for their 100th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of Carnegie Hall. It's a big deal, right? So I took my mother and my mother-in-law and about 20 relatives to New York to the concert. And, you know, that was a kind of turning point for my mother to sit in a box with me at Carnegie Hall and seeing a whole big, you know, sold-out audience hear the St. Louis Symphony play my music. You know, it was really kind of a vindication of, okay, I did something that was other people like, so it was justified. And my mother was actually quite moved by the whole thing, you know, and very proud to be there and all this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's something like your compositions, obviously not all of them, but I think a lot of your compositions, I think, are something that can like it change. Like, let me just talk about my own experience, which is it changes my brain state. There's not a lot of music that can do that to me, but that actually like somehow puts me in a different mode of being. And I think I wonder if like your mom being able to experience that, if you know, versus like say someone who like, I don't know, there's something about your music that I think like entrains the entire audience into one mode of being. I mean, this is just, again, this is my own, I'm not a music scholar. I studied philosophy. So it is this is a weird way maybe of describing it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm trying to think of like you have the power to like bring her into something. You had the power, you know, to bring her into something. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, but I think in the case of my mother, she never experienced my music in that way. The kind of music she liked was Perry Como and Bing Crosby and, you know, this music of the 40s and that she grew up with. And I'm such a far leap from all that kind of thing that I don't think she could really connect with it. I know I gave her records all during my career. You know, I'd bring her when I'd have a release, and I think when she died, we went over there and none of them had been opened or played. So, you know, it was like she was proud of me that I'd finally done something that people recognized as having some worth. But I don't think she could connect with the music I was doing.
Do you think when you were growing up, did you have a different path that you were on that then got pushed to music? You know, when you said when you studied with those teachers in Reading, or you know, going off to San Francisco, were you always single-minded about writing or performing?
No, I wanted to do music. It was just that it was hard to connect with music. I didn't have any friends that were doing music, and until I met these two teachers in high school, I really didn't have a community to there were a couple of people who were visual artists in Reading before that I met, and I connected with them, and I'd hang out at their house a lot, and they liked music, and they'd let me practice on their piano and things like this. So that was all, but it was I always wanted to do music, but it was, you know, you have to have a community in some kind of support system to do it. When you're a kid, especially, you know, you're still discovering things about yourself, and these people, if you have somebody that kind of enforces those discoveries and lets you think that and supports you in them, then you go so much faster. You know, you progress so much faster. So it took a long time for that to happen for me. But once I got to that's why I say San Francisco is important, because I went to San Francisco State and I met Pauline Oliveras and Lauren Rush and Joe Weber and Ken Benshaw. I had these people who all became, you know, pretty well-known musicians in their own right, and many of them had much more experience in music than I did, because I'd come down from Reading. They'd already been growing up in a sophisticated area of, you know, the Bay Area, where lots of music opportunities to hear music and to study with different teachers existed. And so I was coming into this as kind of the fresh kid from the country, didn't know anything. And so I was learning as much from my peers when I went to Reading as I was my teachers. Hanging out with friends that did music was a very exciting thing to happen to me. So it wasn't until 1955, I was 20 years old, that I really got to, to really immerse in it. You know, culturally in every way, having people and going to concerts at the Opera House and in San Francisco, going to symphony concerts. I'd never seen a symphony, orchestra before that, so it was quite a amazing time of my life, awakening.
Do you think that coming from that kind of working class background, though, gave you something different? Or was it, I mean, have you thought about I think a lot about the two of the big things. You hit upon one of them. Two of the big things I think about when I think about people who do creative work that is defining or world changing or something like that, right? There has to be some kind of movement. There has to be a movement that it comes out of, right? There has to be a bunch of people and friends, and they're bouncing ideas off of each other, right? And I think of it kind of like a pressure cooker of concepts and ideas and thoughts, right? And then the other thing is, I think you have to have some kind of you have to be other in some way, right? Either have to be either religiously other or ethnically other or in terms of economic class other. I think there has to be some bit of that pushes people to the side that makes them not take the path that everyone else is taking. And I'm curious if you thought about that, if you thought about coming from a working class background, or if there's any other kind of thing that you think that kind of pushed you to the side a little bit.
It's so, it's such a complex issue that you're raising a question that I've thought about a lot, why did I do this kind of thing? But there's so many factors involved that I would say that's only one of them. But one of the important things about this coming from a working class background and also getting started very late in learning music and also not having a really academic background in music, I resisted having training in counterpoint and harmony and orchestration, all these things that composers need. So not having resisted that all the time, it formed the kind of music that I did, which was kind of homemade, just out of whatever I thought music should be. And I think that's important. That's the fact that I wasn't trained, that I didn't have the opportunities to go to a conservatory or, this kind of thing, had a lot to do with the kind of music I eventually ended up doing, which is identified with me, my personality, etc.
Yeah, no, it is a very, look, one of the things I do on the show is I reduce very complex things to anecdotal and easy prompts that I know don't actually capture. I'm just kind of curious a lot of times about, the kinds of factors, especially that I think it is interesting too that composition, I mean, I guess it always has this kind of high class veneer to it. And was there any kind of anxiety about going, especially coming from a working class background, going into something that had this veneer of elite, as opposed to going into playing rock and roll or, something that was maybe had less of a elite sheen on it in the 50s and the 60s?
Mm-hmm. Well, my peers again were a big factor in making it all feeling like I belonged. When I get around a crowd of people, if I've written an orchestra piece and I have to go rehearse with an orchestra, and I know that I haven't had orchestration classes and that it's kind of homemade, and I've kind of done things in a different way. I do have a lot of inferiority feelings arise when I'm around these people who had these, academic training. But then when I hear the music, when I hear what I've done, I don't feel that way. It's just trying to, when the conductor asks me to explain things or to do technical things in the orchestra, I always feel a little bit unqualified to do that. And maybe I don't even hear it right, because I work in a very kind of primitive way when I'm in my studio. So to transfer that to a concert, to a stage with an orchestra, my way of working, it's a little bit awkward. But I think that usually the orchestras get who I am and end up doing a good job producing the music. But it is kind of a leap, to if I'm and I'm most comfortable musically when I'm playing myself on stage or playing with my son Gyan. We have a duo. These kind of things I feel more comfortable because I don't have to be anybody but myself. I walk out and play for people, and I am who I am. And but it's only when I'm working with classical musicians usually that I feel unqualified in that sense, that I don't really belong to that world, even though I've written a lot of orchestral music. But mainly because I do like the process of imagining sounds in the orchestra and what can happen. So, but it's just I'm a little bit of an outsider there. So there's some feelings of discomfort, which have gotten better over the years as I've done it more and more.
Was there a moment where you felt you were onto something? And it doesn't have to be like a moment of like, I was signed to Columbia, or it could be that. But like, do you feel that there was a moment where you realized that you were doing something that was different?
There were many moments, when I think the moment you're referring to was I was living in Europe for a couple of years after I got out of graduate school for UC Berkeley. This would be 1962 and 63. And I was kind of like trying to find a voice, trying to find out. I was still, I'd already written a lot of music in grad school. But when I went to Europe, I was kind of living a vagabond existence, making my living playing piano for floor shows and playing in bars but I was also running into interesting musical personalities in Europe, like David Allen, who later formed Soft Machine and Gong, became a good friend of mine in Paris. And, I met Burroughs and I met Brian Geisen and some of the cultural heroes of the age. And so I was trying to figure out how I fit into all this, because these are people I admired too, that were kind of very individualistic, had their own way of working. But I was different than them. I was kind of like straddling these worlds of both classical music and jazz and pop music. So toward the end of my stay in Europe, this friend of mine, Ken Dewey, who was a playwright, came to Paris, and he, with the Living Theater and some other actors, and he'd written a play called The Gift, and he got commissioned by the Theater Récamier Theater of Nations to put on a play at the Theater Récamier in Paris in '63. So he came to see me in Paris and asked me if I wanted to do the music for it. And this was the first opportunity I'd had to do anything like that in Europe. Most of the stuff I'd been doing had been street theater and kind of happening type things with both with Ken and other people. And so as part of this process, I met Chet Baker, and Chet Baker became part of this musical idea. I convinced him, and Ken convinced him to join us with his quartet to be the music part of the music. And the other part of the music was I was going to take the quartet and record them at the Theater Récamier. And I hadn't had this kind of opportunity either, to actually go into a recording studio with a world-famous jazz quartet and create some music with them. So that collaboration with Chet Baker was, I think, a real defining moment for me, because then I realized working with musicians like that was probably what I really wanted to do, this exciting kind of collaboration where things are very loose and you're just patching together a bunch of ideas and trying to do something that nobody knows how it's going to come out. So that was, for me, I think if I had to go to any period, that was the first big moment of kind of discovery.
Did anything inside you change through this kind of discovery? And what I mean by that is, I think about when I finally kind of figured out my own creative voice. Like, I personally settled. Like, there was a settling inside me. And I'm always curious if that happens to other people. If there is something about like who you are as a person that kind of changes through this creative discovery.
Yeah, I think you begin to trust throwing yourself into the abyss and the chaos, and trust that you're going to come out okay, that you'll survive it, even if everything is a failure. And to me, it's that changed. It just changed my ability to trust the unknown, and it's only I've only found I've had high level experiences in music when I've done that, when I've gotten rid of my fear of the unknown and really tried to work with it and explore it and feel comfortable with not knowing what you're doing. So in that sense, I think around this period too, that was starting to happen to me, is that I'd had the moments like this in my life before that, but after that period, I decided that that's really what I wanted, was to invite chaos into my life musically and see if I could swim through it to something that was rewarding and new and exciting for everybody.
Before this moment, were you afraid of the unknown or afraid of chaos in general? Like, I've always been afraid since I was a kid. I was afraid of like gray areas. I was afraid of chaos. I needed things to be defined. And it's only, as I've become an adult and as I've become better at writing, that I've settled, that I've like you said, invited the chaos in and been comfortable in it. But before that, it was always anxiety producing. And I'm kind of curious if it was like, what was your reaction to chaos prior to this moment? Not just like creatively, but just in your life, period.
The anxiety never went away. It's just that now I know that's the way to operate. And even today, I'll sometimes have to take on a project, and it isn't so much anxiety. It's just like, oh, this is a little bit painful. I know that I'm working with something here. I don't understand it at all, but you sort of trust that that nothing bad can happen out of that. The worst thing can happen. You can be a total flop or failure to move anybody with anything you're doing, or move yourself with anything you're doing. But there's those feelings, I think, are always there. But I think that's what makes warriors, I think warriors are probably almost all afraid when, it's just that they bite the bullet and go ahead and do it. And so I really agree with the people that say nothing ever comes out of not taking risks, that this is my own personal experience, that taking risks has produced the kind of work that I feel is valuable for me. And it's always involved working with the unknown or chaotic elements that don't seem to have relationship, and you're trying to go into them and live with them till you see that there is an underlying relationship in everything. And you tie them together and they all make sense. And then that's what kind of thrills the listener too, is they're hearing things that, oh, this is kind of an amazing landscape. How did this happen?
Yeah. Do you think there are moments from your, like, either when you were a kid, when you were a teenager, anytime before this, where you took risks? I'm just trying to think about like moments that like were foundational for you to then have the courage to take creative risks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's always happened to me through music, and happened later. I think when I was a kid, I was just afraid to do things, and I didn't do them. Most life things that I was afraid of, like a fear of heights and things like that, I never got over. I still haven't. It was just, I think I learned this through music in order to deal with it on a daily basis, working with the unknown aspects of music. I mean, music is even like just playing music, improvising. I still feel, even when I'm improvising, I like to throw myself beyond what I can actually play and hear, and sometimes results in an enormous mess, that nobody would want to listen to, but by doing that, you keep thinking that you won't be repeating your habits. That's one of the things you have to do with music, is try to not get into just habits of doing. I mean, we do that anyway, but to try to resist the temptation to just do something because it was successful one time when you did it. So that's why I think I do these kind of things and try to keep the whole ball game very loose. And
I mean, look, this is reductive what I'm about to say, so please take it with a grain of salt. But I mean, you have this childhood where you are moving about. You have your father has PTSD. There are a lot of kinds of, like, I would say, chaotic things in your childhood that at some point, again, this is reductive, that creating music or like facing the chaos in the music kind of helps you overcome, ? I guess.
Yeah, it's possible. But doesn't everybody, I mean, life is kind of like, almost everybody I know has big issues of, life is not smooth. It's craggy and dirty and messy, and almost everyone I know is always working through problems of life. So I never felt that mine were exceptional. They were just kind of like everybody else I knew. I mean, the people that did have that kind of a smooth life, they always seemed to sleep to me,
Yeah, but you also seem like a very kind and open and empathetic person. And I'm kind of curious, is that just something that you've developed as you have through your life, or have you always been this kind of person? That's, again, we've interacted for like 45 minutes. So, it just, you come off as a very kind and open person.
I think I've been gifted with kind of an optimistic, sunny personality, basically, on the optimistic side, and happy and like to laugh, this kind of thing. I think that's a gift. It's something I was given. My friends, when I was young in high school, used to get mad at me. Why are you smiling all the time? Wipe that smile off your face. And I said, I can't help it. I'm happy. This is something. This is like who we are, what we do. So for me, being kind is part of, because I do have a great love of humanity, of people, and their struggles, of what they're going through, and I do empathize with that. And but that kind of came to me not through study, or it was something just that happened to me.
When I talk to people who were teenagers in the 50s and then into the 60s, one of the things I'm always curious about is, because I only ever interact with that time period through movies, usually through fiction, right? I'm only interacting through that time period in fiction. So it always comes to me fully formed, as if the 60s were the 60s, were this kind of like period where crazy things are happening everywhere. And like, just, when someone says the 60s, what do you think of? And I'm kind of curious about how it actually felt as you were going through it.
They say, what is it about the 60s? If you remember the 60s, you weren't there. And I do have a hard time kind of remembering, when I think back of, where I was. Okay, I was in Europe in the early 60s. I was in grad school at the very beginning of the 60s. And at that time, I was around Berkeley a lot, and there was a lot of political action happening with students in Berkeley, and the whole period of the 60s that I remember was fairly turbulent. I think the Vietnam War started in the 60s, right? And so although there was this amazing kind of renaissance in rock music and everything that was happening simultaneously, it wasn't all Strawberry Fields Forever. There was a lot of, turbulence and demonstrations in the streets, people being shot, all kind of things that happen today, were happening a lot then. But the one thing that I really feel that I loved about the 60s, Well, for one thing, all the men started looking like Jesus with long hair and beards, and that was new for me because I'd had a crew cut I remember when I went to Europe, I had a crew cut because I guess I inherited this from my dad of looking kind of like a military guy, and I had hair then too, so I was able to have a crew cut. But I remember running into David Allen in '62 in Paris and in the street, and David already had this long red hair and was kind of really crazily liberated guy. And that was kind of the beginning for me of seeing that, I started seeing more and more people like this. And just to watch that happen, that whole society, suddenly everybody's wearing long hair. And then you start hearing about Timothy Leary's giving acid to people in New York, and what's acid, so the period of discovery with drugs was big in the 60s, and I was part of that. I mean, I actually, wanted to take peyote and mushrooms and LSD and because people were doing it, and they were writing about their experiences, and I was reading about these experiences, and I thought, God, you got to do this. It's like a whole other world that we're not aware of in our normal consciousness. So these kind of things of the 60s are the strongest memories for me of opening consciousness, and everybody suddenly not so worried about making a living, but trying to be happy, and gathering together in large groups and feeling community in large groups. So it was a bit, when I wrote NC, it was a lot about bringing my friends together to play music. It wasn't about a musical revolution. It was really, I wanted something we could do together to jam. And so I think those feelings were really strong in the 60s, and it seemed like the world was going to change then. But then the 70s came, and everybody went back to business school and making money. So to watch the world go through these cycles, over and kind of leaning a little bit toward the left, leaning a little bit toward the right, whatever terms you use for this. Seems to be what we do,
Yes. I mean, that's why I asked this question a lot, because it seems like in my lifetime, we've experienced, in the last 5, maybe 10 years, depending on how you want to define it, we have gone through a similar paradigm shift into something different. And to me, it felt weird. It actually felt more menacing, because it seemed like we went into a paradigm shift that things got worse. Seemingly, it felt like it. And I tend to romanticize the 60s, especially talking to my dad, and that it felt like there was like a period of a certain, 5 or 10 years where things felt open. Like, I like the way you describe it. You felt like there was community, there was experimentation, and it felt like, in my mind, it feels this was a period, a very fertile period, because things opened up in a certain sense. And so these kind of like paradigm shifts that cultures go through are very, I'm very curious about, especially this one, because I don't think I ever felt one where things opened up like that. It's always felt like a paradigm shift in my lifetime. Things have gotten more tense, more menacing. Mm. You having lived through both of these shifts that I'm talking about, I'm curious if you have, if you've experienced something similar, or if I just don't have enough perspective.
Tell me about the second one again. When is this? The other?
Maybe since the financial crash in 2008. It feels like we've gone through a looking glass, maybe.
What about 9/11? Isn't that kind of the beginning of something big?
That's also...
To me, that's a big... We really crossed the line there. America finally got slammed by a foreign power on its own soil for years bombing in other countries around the world and not having an American catastrophe like that. So, well, one of the things, I don't know if I'm clear on your question, but one of the things that we didn't talk about that I think was happening is that, beginning with the end of the war and the introduction of nuclear weapons and having bombed Japan and actually used these bombs on civilian populations, I think everybody's consciousness was focused very much on another war happening. And at the end of during the 50s, people were building bomb shelters and stuff and doing drills in school, kids getting under. And this thing was very much a big part of the consciousness of the whole world. Like, how long would it be before we dropped it again? Because it was so close to people who were alive in 1945 and remembered the bombing. That was a huge deal. And to think that it would happen again seemed inevitable. I mean, everybody was, and just how long would it be? And the Cold War was going on, and everybody felt threatened that it would happen again, that we wouldn't have the sense to not drop these bombs. So I think by the time the 60s hit, by the early 60s hit, and it hadn't happened, it was 15 years later, people started coming out of their caves, we're not going to be killed by the bomb, so let's go have a party, So I think that was a big part of it.
Oh, I don't think anyone's ever phrased it like that before. Like that, it was this moment of kind of like a part, like we were not annihilated. The thing that we thought was this catastrophe that we thought was going to happen didn't happen. Let's celebrate the fact that that everything is still here.
That's a factor, I think, in contributing to that period. And now as we go on, we become numb to that, and that's when the bomb's going to hit us for sure. Because everybody thinks there's been. You never die when you're expecting to die. It's always like comes out of the blue. Oh, I'm dying.
That's right. I've thought about this before, but like you're 10 years old when the war finally ends, right?
Yeah. When the bomb was dropped, I was 10, 1945, I was 10 years old.
I mean, do you remember like that day in the same way that I can remember 9/11 very, very clearly?
Oh yeah. I was listening to the radio and, when they were announcing in the newscast that, we had a super bomb. And they were kind of exaggerating its power. Like it could blow up the whole world. It's like nobody knows its power, and they were talking about it on the radio. And we dropped it on Japan, and this is going to end the war. And of course, everybody's immediate reaction was, "Oh God, the war is going to end." It's been 3 years of brutal, or 3.5 years of brutal fighting worldwide, and so everybody's immediate reaction was relief. Oh, we've got a bomb now, and nobody will ever be able to start a war with us again. Of course, they didn't think beyond that somebody else is going to get the bomb, right away too. But I remember hearing the radio broadcasts and asking, trying to get some information from my parents and my grandmother about this bomb and everything. Of course, nobody really knew what it was. Everybody had because it had been kept a secret right up until the time, of dropping it. Nobody was hearing about it. It was really a closely guarded secret. Well, at least nobody in my circle. And and so, like, people didn't know what it was. But then they heard, how many people, it leveled the whole city, one bomb. And that's unimaginable, up to this time. People have been fighting a war for 3.5 years, having to have multiple bomb raids to level a city. And here they did it with one bomb. So we knew it was a big deal. And when I heard it, it was a major turning point in my life of kind of like being frightened by this thing. So everybody thought, as I said before, everybody thought that, okay, they're going to use this again pretty soon, And we had every time we'd have a kind of a conflict arise, you'd expect a nuclear war to happen. And then when Kennedy backed down Khrushchev, was it Khrushchev? Who was the Russians, about Cuba. I was in Paris when that happened, and saw the news in the newspapers in Paris, walking down the street. And one day when this was happening in Cuba, all the alarms, air raid alarms and sirens started going off in Paris. So I thought it had happened. that we'd actually gone to war with, that the nuclear war had happened in Cuba. It had happened. It was some other kind of alert in Paris at the time, but I was really waiting for the mushroom cloud to hit. And that's the kind of the way people lived in those days, that, under fear of the bomb happening again. Like Dr. Strangelove, how I learned to live with the bomb. That movie's fantastic. I mean, it really sums up the feeling of the time.
Yeah, and then okay, so in that moment of like celebration, then I think it's interesting also then that you were able to that in this moment of like experimentation, you became the musician you became.
Yeah, I think so.
So it was the cultural opening, it was the cultural celebration that maybe gave you this space. Again, this is very reductive, so please.
Well, it's all the things we've been talking about. Yeah, they were all coming together during that time.
To a time that seems like it was a singular creative time in the 20th century into now. Like I've never experienced a time like that. I don't, in my entire lifetime. I don't think there's been something as kind of like culturally celebratory as that moment that you experienced, that, those years.
Yeah, I think, well, the thing is, things like this only happen once. Then the other things that happen are, other waves of experience that are built on that. So that keeps happening. But that was like a big one because, it happened for the first time in everybody's lifetime. And it reinforced everybody's feelings. The society in general started going in a particular way. And it was a force that even the reactionary people in the country were having trouble stopping. It just mushroomed the kind of feeling and exuberance of the 60s.
It fed back into this positive thing.
There were reactionary people, of course, but, they couldn't stop it.
That actually seems like a really nice place to end.
Okay.
Terry, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, Andrew, nice talking to you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.